They arrived just after the frost had lifted, before the sun had dried the dew off the asylum's broken front steps. One by one, 21 men stepped down from a single black carriage that seemed far too narrow to have held them all. They wore white coats so clean they looked boiled, buttons polished to a shine, and carried no suitcases, only small leather satchels that clinked faintly when they walked. Their shoes were identical, their collars stiff and pressed. And their eyes, though calm, almost friendly, were unreadable in a way that made the nurses shift in place without understanding why. The director of Mercy Asylum, a frail man with a failing liver, greeted them with gratitude. He had written months earlier to various philanthropic medical boards begging for aid. Patients were piling in faster than they could house them. Fevers, fits, sudden mutism, and a new sickness no one had a name for yet. When these doctors appeared unannounced but bearing forged-seeming letters of approval, the staff did not question. They were desperate. The doctors spoke softly, almost in whispers, nodding graciously, complimenting the grounds, the chapel, the air. They asked to be shown the records, the worst cases, the most forgotten rooms. They smiled when they were told about the mute girls on the 3rd floor, the boys who pulled their teeth out in sleep, the mothers who rocked invisible infants. That first night no one heard them speak above a murmur, yet the patients calmed. Screams that had echoed nightly fell silent. The nurses, relieved, told each other the new doctors must have brought some calming powder or new tonic. But they never saw any administered. No one ever saw the doctors carry medicine, only those clicking satchels they kept by their sides, which they never opened around others. Within days, the asylum changed. The doctors asked for certain rooms to be emptied. They wished to restructure treatment flows, they said. Some wings were sealed off entirely, windows painted over. Doors rehinged to open inward instead of out. One by one, the older staff were reassigned, rotated, pushed to day duty only. The night belonged to the doctors. They moved silently, always in groups of 3, never alone. They left no notes but returned every morning with their coats spotless and breath cold. Some nurses noticed that the air in the West Wing was growing warmer despite the winter. They swore they saw flickers of light beneath the sealed door. Once, one nurse pressed her ear to the wood and thought she heard humming, not of voices but of metal. She said it sounded like knives being tuned. That nurse left the next morning without collecting her pay. When asked, she only said her mother was ill and refused to return. By the end of the month, 3 more nurses followed her out. No replacements were hired. Still, the doctors smiled. They stood in chapel every Sunday in perfect rows, never singing, only mouthing the hymns. They never blinked at sermons about sin or the soul, but stared straight ahead, hands folded. When Father Elric asked one of them where he had trained, the doctor gave a name no one recognized and added, "We were taught by those who see the body as map and language, not just vessel." The priest did not ask again. Outside, snow gathered. Patients continued to vanish from the intake roster. When questioned, the doctors explained they had been transferred to distant care. They showed no paperwork, but the director, growing weaker by the day, nodded his consent each time. Staff told themselves that surely these transfers were real. Surely someone would question it if they weren't. But the truth was simpler. No one wanted to be the one who looked too long. There was something about the way the doctors looked at you, never cruel, never kind, just waiting, as if you were a book they had already read and knew the ending of, as if they were giving you time to close yourself before they opened you again. One orderly, half drunk after his shift, claimed he passed by the bath ward one night and saw a doctor soaking his hands not in water, but in something thick and dark, rubbing slowly as if trying to remove fingerprints. Another nurse said she peeked into the incinerator room and saw a doctor measuring ashes with a silver ladle. No one reported these incidents, not officially. Whispers filled the gaps. Maybe they were ritualists, maybe they were surgeons from wars never written about, or maybe, just maybe, they weren't doctors at all. But by then it was too late. The white coats had become part of the walls. Their presence was no longer questioned, their names still unknown. Mercy Asylum belonged to them now, and as the winter deepened and the snow began to melt black against the building's foundation, something stirred beneath the surface. Something older than medicine, quieter than murder, and far more patient than any living man. Clara never spoke. Not a sound, not a murmur, not a sob. Not even the small unconscious noises most children make in sleep. She was 12 when she arrived at Mercy, eyes dull and limbs thin from too many nights without food. But she was not violent. She followed nurses like a shadow, always barefoot, always clutching the frayed cuff of her own sleeve. When the new doctors began their rounds, she was one of the first they noticed. They surrounded her bed in silence, watching her sleep as if listening for something her body might be saying beneath the quiet. The lead among them, a doctor with no name on record, only a stitched emblem in the shape of an open eye on his coat, requested she be transferred to what he called the mirror room. He spoke gently, assuring staff she would not be harmed, that he believed her silence was a kind of language, a frozen alphabet ready to thaw. No one questioned him. How could they? They were told these men were saviors. Their coats still gleamed. Clara was taken in the morning. She didn't resist. She walked beside the doctors like she'd done it before in a dream. One nurse, a woman named Faye, recalled Clara turning her head at the last moment and staring straight into her eyes. Not frightened, not pleading, just resigned. Faye still remembered that look decades later in a nursing home where no one believed her. By nightfall, Clara's name was gone from the roster. A note was added, "Treatment successful, transferred." But no carriage had arrived. No escort was seen. Her bed was stripped bare and remade. Her few belongings were removed. Her absence was explained away with practiced ease. But it was what came after that truly unsettled the staff. 3 days later, during the evening linens check, Nurse Harrow screamed. Others rushed in thinking she'd found a body. But it wasn't Clara's body, it was a replica. Wax, molded and set in her bed, tucked under the blankets as though sleeping. The face was nearly perfect. Mouth slightly open, eyes shut, brow furrowed in the same half-worried way Clara used to sleep. The hands were folded over the chest, delicate and pale, but there were imperfections. A thin seam ran down the side of her face as though the head had been opened and resealed. Beneath the ears, 2 dark pinholes glistened, places where something had been inserted then removed. Her fingernails were translucent. Too thin, as if scraped down from something larger. Most disturbing of all, she was warm to the touch. The doctors arrived within minutes, not running, not startled, calm. They asked the nurses to return to their duties, explained that the effigy was a therapeutic visual, a symbol of recovered presence. They said Clara had been cured of her muteness, that her silence had been a shell, and she had now found speech. The figure in the bed was to remind the others that healing was possible, that even silence could be sculpted into expression. But the nurses knew better. Clara was gone, not moved, not transferred, gone. And what lay in her bed was not a symbol. It was a replacement, a placeholder for a child whose body might never be found. No one reported it, not to the state, not to the church, not even to one another. Whispers took the place of conversation. Eyes avoided contact. The wax effigy remained in Clara's bed for a week. Then one morning it was simply gone. The sheets stripped bare again, as if it had never been there. The mattress, however, was darker in the center, as if something had melted through, as if warmth had lingered too long. Nurse Harrow asked if she could be moved to another ward. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. Others stopped entering that room unless forced. Still, the doctors smiled. They continued their rounds, and when the director asked how the new protocols were working, they nodded and said, "Remarkable progress. Silence is no longer a barrier, it is a door." That phrase stuck in the minds of those who heard it. A door. The kind that opens only once from one side. The kind that doesn't close after you. And as winter deepened, more patients began to vanish. Always the quiet ones. Always the ones no one visited. The first was Clara. But Mercy would remember her only in wax. It began with construction that no one requested. One morning, a group of men in gray uniforms arrived before dawn, unloading bricks, tar, rolls of thick wool, and massive beams of unfinished oak from an unmarked wagon. They did not speak. Their faces were obscured by long scarves and shaded caps, their eyes downturned as if under instruction not to see. When the director asked who approved the renovations, the doctors responded simply that a donation had been made. A private endowment from a silent benefactor who wished to remain unnamed. The director nodded, too weak now to question anything that came from those white coats. His cough had worsened. His handwriting trembled. It didn't matter. The asylum no longer belonged to him. The wing chosen for alteration had once housed the long-term, incurable patients, those deemed irreversible. They were the forgotten, the catatonics, the blind, the speechless, the ones who never walked the halls or called out at night. The doctors claimed they needed a more controlled environment, a space with proper insulation, isolation, and quiet. For healing, they said, for breakthrough treatments. So the windows were bricked over one by one, sunlight shut out like sin, and the hallways padded with oak planks lined in wool and sealed with layers of pitch-black tar. Every door was reinforced with metal hinges that opened only inward, and no keys were given to staff outside the doctor's circle. The smell was immediate, heavy, chemical, oily. Tar clung to everything. Even the curtains in other wings began to reek of it. A nurse named Elsie swore she saw blood mixed in the mortar between bricks, dark and glistening as if stirred and fresh. When she reported it to one of the doctors, he smiled and said, "Blood holds memory. We prefer our walls to remember." She never asked again. Soon after, patients were moved in, always at night, never more than one at a time. The chosen ones were quiet, fragile, deeply broken. Those who'd stopped speaking long ago or who sat with eyes blank and fingers twitching like metronomes. The staff were not informed of their diagnoses or of the treatments being used. They were simply marked for transfer. Once led into the wing, no patient ever returned. At first, the staff told themselves it was a good sign. Perhaps the patients were improving, being relocated, discharged quietly. But the roster wasn't shrinking. It was changing. Names were crossed out, replaced with strange symbols. Circular patterns, dots, mirrored letters that meant nothing in any known language. One nurse said she saw a ledger where instead of numbers, each patient was listed with a sound. Not a word, a sound, phonetically spelled. The nurse left the asylum 2 days later without a word. Her room was cleaned before her resignation was processed. At night, the wing pulsed with faint vibrations. The wool on the walls, meant to muffle cries, began to move subtly on its own, as if breathing. Faint humming could be heard through the heating vents, low, toneless, steady. Not the kind of humming a person makes. It had rhythm but no melody. Some believed it was machinery, others weren't so sure. The smell of blood joined the tar. Metallic, sharp, unmistakable. It drifted up through the floorboards into the nurse quarters. so thick that one night a junior orderly vomited in her sheets and blamed it on spoiled food. The kitchen staff had no explanation. Nothing had spoiled, nothing had changed. Except the air. Over time, even the staff began to avoid the west corridor. No one wanted to walk past it, even in daylight. Doors were never opened, no doctor was seen entering or exiting. But at roll call, the doctors always marked the patients inside as stable. That word became meaningless. Stable meant unseen. Stable meant sealed. Stable meant forgotten. And deep behind those padded, sweating walls, the wing held its silence like a living thing. Swollen with secrets, warmed by tar, pulsing in time with a rhythm no human ever should have heard. They wheeled it in under a white sheet as if delivering a gift. Two doctors guided it silently through the central hallway, nodding politely at the passing staff who averted their eyes without knowing why. It looked like a dentist's chair, at first. Polished metal arms, adjustable recline, leather bindings at the ankles and wrists. But beneath the chair, where a simple footrest might have been, there were tubes. Glass tubes wound in spirals like transparent intestines, each lined with dark residue. The headrest was fixed with an iron halo that clicked shut behind the patient's skull. When a nurse asked what it was, one of the doctors replied without hesitation. "For extraction. We're studying the inner humors." No one pressed further. The chair was placed in a newly cleared room beside the sealed wing. The door was always locked. No schedule was posted, no records logged. But staff began to notice patterns. Patients who had long suffered from fever dreams. Those who murmured names that weren't theirs. Those who refused food but clutched their stomachs like something inside still fed. Those were the ones called in. They walked in unescorted, dazed, compliant. They never returned. Their names disappeared from the roll call and were replaced by numbers. One nurse noticed that each number matched the count of tubes now visible beneath the chair. By midwinter, there were 11. What happened inside the room was not documented in writing, but the signs seeped through, blood smears that couldn't be scrubbed from the hallway grout, the smell of scorched calcium, and the chair, always warm, even after hours of disuse. A porter who emptied trash bins nearby once swore he heard the sound of bones being cracked, but not shattered, not in a single blow. He said it sounded like slow pressure, like someone twisting dry wood until it gave way. Another orderly fainted after noticing a small sliver of white substance left behind on the armrest. He thought it was ivory until it crumbled under his glove. The truth came later in fragments whispered between staff. The doctors weren't removing organs or limbs. They were removing the marrow itself, hollowing the bones of living patients and replacing the inner cavity with liquid quicklime. It was done slowly, with instruments so precise the skin was left unbroken in places. The patients remained conscious, iron masks bolted over their faces to muffle screams. Those who struggled had their limbs pierced with rods to keep the bones from collapsing mid-procedure. Nurses overheard the doctors discussing it like clockmakers, timing the muscular flutter as the lime met living marrow. They noted how long it took for each patient's body to cease twitching, how some resisted longer depending on diet, blood type, even dreams. They called it silent combustion. None of the staff intervened. Some pretended not to know. Others left and were never replaced. A few stayed, either too afraid or too curious to walk away. One nurse claimed she saw a finished body once. A former patient named Eli who used to weep into his pillow every night and beg for his dead mother. His corpse was left on a gurney for precisely 90 seconds before being wheeled away. His limbs looked intact, but when the nurse tried to lift his arm, it was feather-light, weightless. She said it felt like lifting the shell of a bird, as if nothing inside remained. The skin was cool, but his chest still rose and fell slightly as if something was breathing through him. The doctors continued their work without pause. They smiled, they catalogued, they sharpened the drill bits by hand. And every time a patient was led in, they said the same thing to the staff. We are not harming them. We are refining what remains. It wasn't medicine. It wasn't mercy. It was ritual, method, and study wrapped in the theater of care. And beneath the floors, the tubes in the chair glowed faintly white, pulsing with the liquefied memory of those who once dared to scream. The first of them was seen carried down the corridor at dawn, his chest swollen and immobile beneath a fogged dome of glass. The nurses didn't recognize the patient, not by face, not by chart. The only thing they remembered was that he'd been one of the last mute boys left on the third floor, the one who used to trace circles on the wall and exhale as if whispering to something no one else could see. Now he wasn't exhaling at all. His ribs were visible through the glass, each bone ridged in stark detail, lungs barely fluttering beneath the sealed dome like two trapped birds. His mouth opened and closed, but no air moved. The dome had no valve, no hinge, no release. It was weeks before the staff learned how it was done. The doctors had developed their own casting method, using blown glass shaped to the curve of the human chest. The patient's rib cage was measured with string soaked in oil. Then the molds were fired in a kiln repurposed from the old chapel furnace. Once cooled, each dome was sealed over the bare rib cage and affixed with black resin around the edge, airtight, unbreakable. No anesthesia was used. The doctors claimed the pain was part of the purification, that when the lungs were given no choice but to feel every gasp, their decay revealed something divine. The process was said to take hours. At first, the lungs resisted flaring against the vacuum, trying to swell with memory and air. But slowly, inevitably, the pressure turned inward. Each breath became thinner, tighter, more desperate. The patients did not scream. They couldn't. Their throats closed, their eyes bulged. Their hands clawed at the armrests of the chairs until nails split and flesh separated from bone. And still the doctors watched, listened, took notes. They described the final collapse of the lungs not as death but as closure. In one of the ledgers, a doctor had written, "When the last breath inverts, the soul attempts to enter backward. The sound it makes is the body pleading in reverse." That sound became known among the staff. It wasn't a gasp or a groan. It was soft, high, and brief, like the final note of a music box winding down. One nurse compared it to the sound of paper crumpling inside a jar. Another said it reminded her of a bird trapped behind glass, wings scraping against the pane until only silence remained. The worst part was the quiet that followed. After the collapse, the glass domes stayed sealed. The bodies remained upright, heads tilted back, mouths ajar. Some staff said they swore the eyes moved for hours after. Others claimed the glass fogged again when no one touched it. But none dared remove them. The domes were considered sacred by the doctors, who referred to them as lungs made legible. The bodies were stored in a basement alcove lined up against the wall, still seated in their chairs. The doctors called it the breathing room. No one else was permitted inside. A maid sent to clean it once returned trembling, unable to speak. She later scratched a single word into her bedroom wall before disappearing entirely. Listening. Over time, more domes were made, more rib cages sealed, more final sounds noted. The doctors continued their recordings, winding phonograph cylinders during each procedure, capturing what they believed were the soul's final attempts to remain. They claimed they were not killing the patients, but revealing what death tried to hide, the sound of life recoiling from itself. They said they were learning how the body confesses when the breath can no longer lie. And all across Mercy Asylum the air grew stiller, heavier, as if the building itself had begun holding its breath. They came in the third month of winter when even the crows had stopped landing on the roof of Mercy Asylum. The sky that morning was low and colorless, the kind that made the snow seem gray before it even touched the ground. A line of wagons creaked up the hill, each one filled not with food or supplies, but children, thin, dirt-smeared, blank-eyed children who stared forward without question. No adults rode with them. The drivers said they had been paid in coin and a note that read, "Deliver to Mercy, care of the doctors. For education and welfare." When the gates opened, the children filed out wordlessly, some barefoot, some with frostbitten fingers wrapped in old cloth. There were no tears, no questions. Only the sound of boots against frozen earth and the shallow breathing of lives long resigned to silence. The staff was never told they were coming. There had been no letters, no announcements, no requisitions for beds or food. The director, by now bedridden and coughing blood, simply waved them through. The doctors, of course, were waiting. They lined the path to the west wing, white coats pristine even against the filthy snow. Each doctor knelt as the children passed, murmuring a phrase none of the nurses could fully hear. Later, one nurse swore the words weren't in English, or any language she knew, but had rhythm, like a lullaby backwards. The children entered the sealed wing without hesitation. The door shut behind them. The locks clanked once, and then nothing. The staff tried not to ask where the children had gone, not aloud. But privately they wondered, why bring in more mouths to feed when resources were stretched? Why house them in the only wing where patients never came out? For a time they tried to believe the children were being educated in secret, trained for future medical study perhaps, or given specialized treatment. But the silence lingered. The meals delivered to the wing were untouched, later returned with utensils wiped clean and placed precisely back in their original position as though measured. Beds meant for the children remained unslept in, their sheets still stiff from starch. And then came the dolls. It was the chapel that gave up the truth, or part of it. On the second Sunday after the children's arrival, Nurse Elsie entered the sanctuary early to light the lanterns. What she found froze her in place. Arranged across the altar, where once a simple cloth had rested, were dolls. Dozens of them, human in form but grotesquely detailed. Each doll was hand-stitched with care, soft gray fabric, seams tight, limbs jointed with thread pulled taut. But their hair was real. Not yarn, not wool. Human strands, some matted, others still curled, tied into braids or coiled in ribbons. Worse still were the mouths. Each doll bore a stitched smile, too wide for its head, and in place of teeth were actual teeth. Tiny, milky baby teeth embedded into the fabric, each one real, each one cleaned and set with surgical precision. No staff member admitted to placing them there. The chapel had been locked. Only the doctors held keys. When asked, they simply said the dolls were offerings. Tokens of gratitude, one doctor explained with a slight smile. The children give what they can. But the staff knew better. They remembered the orphans' faces, quiet, hollow, long starved of comfort. These were not the kind of children who smiled wide or gave thanks. They were survivors. Or had been. The altar dolls changed weekly. Sometimes the fabric appeared fresher. Sometimes the hair was darker, the teeth older, as if drawn from those whose mouths had already begun to rot. One doll bore a strip of cloth with the embroidered name Miriam across its chest, a name one nurse recalled from a ledger dated just a week prior. That name was now crossed out, gone. Others followed. No children were ever seen again. The west wing remained sealed. The smell of iron and resin grew thicker near its doors. When questioned, the doctors spoke only in metaphors. The young carry songs the old cannot sing. In their marrow is the clarity of silence. We preserve what society throws away. The staff stopped asking, but in the months that followed more wagons came, always unmarked, always silent, and Mercy Asylum took them in, child by child, each one disappearing through the soundproof halls. The dolls remained. They multiplied. And in time, the chapel became more a shrine than a sanctuary. Its altar no longer a place of worship, but of warning. A place where silence knelt beside stitched smiles and wept without sound. The deliveries stopped without announcement. For years, Mercy's kitchen had received bi-weekly carts from the town's butchers, slabs of meat wrapped in brown paper, frozen organs packed in straw, bones for stock. Then one week, nothing arrived. The next week, nothing again. The kitchen staff inquired, and the butchers replied that the account had been closed, paid in full, but terminated. No explanation, no transfer order. Just silence. When the kitchen maid brought this news to the head nurse, she expected concern, perhaps panic. Instead, she was told, "Continue cooking. The doctors have sent their own provisions." When she asked what kind, the answer was quiet and final. Unlabeled. The shipments began arriving at night, crates marked only with numbers, no vendors, no stamps, no wax seals, inside meat. Raw, pale, wet, with a smell that clung to the skin. The cuts were unlike anything the staff had handled. Long ribbon tissue curled into tight knots, pale muscle that seemed too smooth, too small. The marrow bones were thin, almost childlike, and when roasted gave off a scent thick with sweetness and iron. The kitchen staff asked no questions. The instructions were clear. Boil everything, strain twice, salt minimally, serve only in covered bowls. The doctors now dined alone. A long table had been set up in the private hall, formerly the lecture room. No staff were allowed inside during mealtime. If called upon, they were to knock once and wait, eyes lowered. Those who peered in, by accident or curiosity, found the same scene every time. 21 men seated in perfect silence, each with a bowl in front of them, heads bowed, hands motionless until the first spoonful was lifted in unison. No conversation, no sound but the clink of silver and the dull echo of swallowing. The meals lasted exactly 21 minutes, every night. One maid, tasked with removing the bowls after supper, noted something odd. Despite the room being sealed and windowless, steam never lingered. The bowls remained warm, but the air felt thin, emptied, as if the act of eating itself had absorbed sound. One evening she noticed the bowls had been scraped clean. Not licked, not wiped, but scraped. Every trace removed as though the contents were not food, but evidence. Rumors spread quickly through the staff dormitories. That the children had never left. That the glass jars in the basement no longer stored only ash and wax. That the marrow harvested in the chair was no longer wasted in study. Some claimed they found teeth in the sink drains. Others, small rings in the trash bins. One cook resigned without notice, refusing to explain why. Another attempted to burn the night's stew in protest, but the pot refused to boil, no matter how high the flame. She said the broth pulsed, as if breathing beneath the lid. The term Feast of Silence was first whispered by a night nurse who'd worked at Mercy for over a decade. She said she'd seen many things, suicides, cruelty, botched procedures, but nothing chilled her like the way the doctors ate. Not because of what they consumed, but how. Each motion was deliberate, ritualized, like a prayer carried out with a spoon. She said they didn't eat to nourish, they ate to remember. As if each mouthful brought them closer to something, or further away. In time, the kitchen grew quieter. Even during prep, no one spoke. Recipes were no longer written down. Meat was simply cut, boiled, and served. The staff no longer asked what it was. They didn't want to know. One porter found a small jawbone lodged in the drain trap, still threaded with pink sinew. He said nothing, just buried it behind the smokehouse under the ash pile and walked away shaking. The doctors continued to dine, every night. And in the stillness of their private hall, they consumed not just flesh, but memory, fear, silence, and perhaps something even deeper. Something that can only be swallowed once it's been taken from someone too small, too forgotten to resist. The chapel had once been the asylum's only place untouched by the doctors. A narrow sanctuary of old wood and faded hymns where sunlight once filtered through dusty glass and the smell of old prayer books lingered in the pews. It was a place where patients were brought to sit quietly, even if they didn't understand why. But over time, even that space changed. The light grew dimmer, the windows darker, not because of storm or season, but because the doctors had painted over the panes with black lacquer. The pews were removed one by one, then the altar, then the crucifix. What remained was a long, echoing room with walls stripped bare, pulleys fixed to the rafters, and spools of copper wire stretched tight across the stone like strings on an unseen instrument. It was no longer a place of worship. It had become something else. The first body appeared on a Tuesday, a patient named Elswin who'd once carved birds into the floorboards with his fingernails. He had been quiet, not violent, the kind of man who whispered apologies to no one in particular. When he vanished from his bed, no alarm was raised. But that morning, when the chapel was opened for sweeping, his body was there, suspended. Not hanging limp, but posed. His arms outstretched, legs splayed slightly forward, chin tilted up as if in offering. Copper wire threaded through the skin at his wrists and ankles, drawn so tight it split the flesh open in small, clean mouths. The wire did not merely bind him, it controlled him. From a central rig attached to the ceiling, a thick copper rod extended down like the neck of a stringed instrument, with knobs for tension. Each wire ran to it, precisely labeled. The entire body, it turned out, could be manipulated. More followed, each week a new patient, never violent, never unpredictable, always the ones no one missed, always the ones who stopped speaking months ago. And each was mounted the same way. Wires through the tendons, taut but deliberate, placed along the chapel's stone walls like silent saints. Their eyes were left open but unblinking, their mouths sewn closed. The skin began to gray after the third day, but the smell never came. Somehow the doctors preserved them. No rot, no flies. Just the hum of tensioned wire vibrating faintly in the cold. Then the sounds began. At first it was thought to be wind through the chimney flues. But the pitch was too clean, too purposeful. The notes came in slow, rising pulses, never overlapping, never chaotic. They seemed intentional. One night, a nurse named Verna slipped inside during the third hour of the night shift and watched from the doorway. The doctors were seated at the base of the chapel, surrounding a small phonograph, cranking it slowly by hand. At the same time, a low electrical generator, silent but present, hummed to life. As the current passed through the wires, the bodies moved. Not wildly, not in convulsion, but in sequence. A twitch in the left hand, a small recoil in the neck, a tightening of the leg. As the generator's pulse shifted, so too did the pattern. The chapel echoed with the soft squeal of wire and the subtle groan of human joints responding to the charge. And above it all, the sound. Not a song exactly, but rhythm, a sequence of trembling moans, half-caught gasps, and bone-deep resonance that filled the rafters like a hymn sung through teeth. The doctors recorded each session on wax cylinders, labeling them with numbers and strange phrases. Canticle of Muscle, Pulse number 6, Liturgy of the Vein. When asked, one doctor explained that pain held musical potential, that the body, stripped of will and reconfigured through design, could speak in a frequency the soul had forgotten. No one spoke of the chapel afterward. The door was kept locked at all hours except when the doctors performed their services. The staff was forbidden to enter. But even in other wings, some claimed they could hear it, the low thrum of wires beneath the floor like the strumming of a cello from below the earth. One patient whispered to a nurse, "I dreamed I was the violin." She died the next morning, found curled against the chapel door, palms burned. Mercy no longer had a place of worship. It had a cathedral of nerves and copper, and the hymns played there were not for God, but for something that listened only when the pain was tuned just right. They had whispered their plan in the laundry cellar beneath the drone of the pressing machine. 4 nurses, worn thin by silence and sleeplessness, decided they would leave, not transfer, not resign, escape. They chose a Sunday when the doctors would be sealed inside the chapel for their so-called ritual. The plan was simple. One would slip into the records room and retrieve documentation of the missing patients. Another would unlock the supply door near the east courtyard, and the others would run. They knew they wouldn't make it far. But even half a mile could bring them to the outer road, where the night patrol sometimes passed. All they needed was one set of eyes outside this place, one ear that still believed in the world beyond Mercy's gates. They never made it that far. By morning, their beds were untouched, linens still smoothed as if no one had ever rested there. Their shifts were left folded at the foot of each cot. The staff said nothing. The matron, pale and trembling, walked the halls as if waiting to be struck. No one spoke of the nurse's plan, not out of guilt but fear. Every person at Mercy knew what happened to those who stepped out of place, but still, no one was prepared for what appeared in the courtyard. 3 days later, just before dawn, the courtyard gate creaked open on its own. The snow had melted back in a perfect circle at the center of the garden, revealing fresh dirt. In its center stood a figure, not lying, not buried, standing, 10 feet tall, stitched together with surgical thread so fine it gleamed in the weak sun. A nurse's uniform had been reconstructed and draped over it, pieced from scraps of the 4 missing women's gowns. The body was grotesque, 6 arms, 2 extending from what had once been a torso, the other 4 sprouting from the rib cage, arched like wings. The legs had been fused into a single column, bound with wire and padded with straw, standing upright like a pillar. The head was shaped but wrong. Elongated, the jaw unhinged and stretched with thread to mimic a smile, too wide, too fixed. Hair had been sewn onto the scalp in careful braids, each one ending in a tiny red ribbon. Standard issue for Mercy's nursing staff. But it was the face that froze the breath in every chest. It was not one woman's face. It was all 4, combined. The skin had been grafted in patches, some pale, others bruised, overlapping to form an almost symmetrical mask. The eyes were open, but made of glass, matching the same type used in the chapel dolls. One glistened with moisture. When the matron saw it, she collapsed to her knees and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. "Our work is holy. Our work is holy. Our work is holy." The doctors did not hide the figure. They did not cover it. Instead, they left it there in plain view, propped upright with rods beneath its robe. One of them, the oldest by appearance, addressed the gathered staff that morning. He called it the custodian. He said it was a reminder that disobedience fractures the body, that those who attempt to divide themselves from purpose will be unified again. He smiled, then turned away. The matron did not leave her room for days. When she returned, she no longer looked anyone in the eye. She simply resumed her duties, voice shaking, hands red from prayer. The other nurses learned quickly. No one asked questions, no one left after curfew. And whenever the wind shifted, bringing the scent of dried blood and resin from the courtyard into the hallway windows, they bowed their heads and whispered the same 3 words. Our work is holy. At Mercy Asylum, there were no runaways, only parts. And when those parts tried to flee, the doctors did not punish. They reassembled. The library had always been locked, not just bolted but sealed. Its iron handle wrapped in rusted chain, the glass panes of its door painted black from the inside. Staff passed it daily, carts clattering over the floorboards, eyes sliding past the dust-caked windows as if by instinct. No one recalled it ever being used. No one recalled anyone ever going in. The directory still listed it as archives and therapeutic literature, but no books were lent, no pages turned. Not for years. Then one winter evening, after a hallway pipe burst and flooded the eastern corridor, the door was forced open to salvage documents. What they found inside was not books, not ink, not paper. The air was thick with the scent of melted fat and dried lavender, clinging sweet and sour in the throat. The shelves, once built to house journals and anatomy texts, now held faces, not portraits, not photographs, molds. Rows and rows of waxen human faces, pale and sagging, each one distinct, eyelids sunken, mouths slack or mid-smile. The impressions were not artistic. They were anatomically perfect, down to the pores, the creases in the lips, the flecks of dead skin sealed into the cheeks. Behind each face was a shallow cavity filled with a mixture of ash and splinters of bone. Embedded in the base of many were small brass plates engraved with initials, or what appeared to be partial dates. None matched asylum records. One nurse recognized a face from a patient long gone, an old woman who used to hum in the bath and count to 500 with her fingers. She had vanished during the first month of the doctor's arrival. Her mold now sat between those of 2 children. Her mouth was open, her teeth gone. The doctor said nothing when questioned. But among the journals recovered from the director's flooded office, one contained entries not in his hand but in perfect cold script. Memory does not reside in the mind alone. It pools in tissue, it curdles in heat. When shaped and sealed, it speaks. Further inspection of the library revealed strange devices, metal funnels, wax basins, molds made from copper and glass, scalpels cleaned and sharpened. One wall bore a rack of wax cylinders labeled Vox Prima to Vox LXX, each wrapped in cloth and sealed with wire. Some believed they held voices. Others believed they held something far older. The doctors, when pressed, described the work as preservation. They said the body was a candle, that what flickers inside us cannot be seen directly, but can be reflected, cast, and held. That in death, if one acts quickly, the shape of thought can be taken. That a scream, if caught before the lungs fully close, leaves an imprint in the face that no ink can ever match. They spoke of unlocking forever in melted layers, of reshaping pain into permanence, of extracting eternity through flesh. The staff stopped going near the library after that. The door was relocked. The room was left to hum in silence. But sometimes, especially late at night when the air was coldest, nurses reported hearing soft clicks from behind the walls, as if something was settling or breathing. Mercy no longer kept books, it kept faces, and in their waxen stillness the memory of every vanished patient waited, not for justice, not for mourning, but to be lit, and played, and remembered forever. No one remembered when he first appeared. There was no arrival carriage, no introduction, no name stitched in thread. Just one day the number changed. Where there had been 20 white-coated men moving in perfect silent rhythm, now there were 21. He stood a little apart during meals, always at the edge of the long table. He did not eat. He did not speak. He watched. When the others moved in practiced lines, measured, mechanical, he drifted behind, hands folded, eyes never blinking. They called him Dr. Harland Vey, or rather they were told that was his name. But no records bore it, no signature in ledgers, no initials on patient files. Nurses asked each other in hushed tones, "Was he here last week? Have you ever seen him perform a procedure?" None had, yet he was always there. In the corner of group meetings, standing at the back of the chapel, leaning at the edge of the surgery theater with his head tilted, as though listening to something only he could hear. His face didn't match the others, while the rest of the doctors looked drawn, aged, exhausted by their tireless cruelty. Dr. Vey remained untouched. His skin smooth, not youthful, but preserved, unchanging. His hair never shifted out of place. His gloves never showed dust. Some nurses whispered that his coat didn't wrinkle even when he sat. Others swore they never saw him sit at all. He simply stood. And when he passed through a corridor, the oil lamps flickered, not from draft, but as if pulled toward him. When one staff member tried to report him to the county office, the letter was returned unopened, the envelope inside blank, the paper scorched at the corners. She resigned the next day, took ill the next, and was buried by the end of the week. No cause determined. In time, staff began to question their own memories. Some claimed there had only ever been 20 doctors, that no 21st coat had walked through the gates that winter, that Dr. Vey was not part of the original group. But their attempts to prove it fell apart. Headcounts changed depending on the hour. Group photos, rare as they were, blurred at the edges, the far-right figure always obscured by glare or smudge. One nurse found an old photo in the archives, dated 2 years before the doctors arrived. In the back corner stood a man who looked exactly like Vey. Same posture, same folded hands, same expressionless eyes. The photo was burned the next day in a staff hearth, though no one confessed to setting the fire. More unsettling were the mirrors. Patients began whispering that a man watched them from the glass, not behind them, but in place of them. One claimed she saw her reflection replaced mid-scream. Another refused to enter her room after catching sight of him where her face should have been. When her bedding was searched, it was found torn from within, as though something had tried to claw its way out. Mirrors were slowly covered across the asylum or shattered outright, yet every new shard seemed to hum. One nurse, brave or broken enough to try, stared into the main stairwell's grand mirror for 7 minutes. When she blinked, she said she saw not a face but a coat hung in air with nothing inside it. The doctors never acknowledged Vey, not once. They never addressed him in front of staff, never consulted him in rounds, never included him in reports. And yet every night he stood among them, at the end of the table, head bowed, unmoving. The one they didn't name, the one they didn't assign, the one who never aged. Long after the asylum closed, survivors spoke of him in interviews. A recurring phrase, there were 20 of them, but 21 shadows. And if you asked those who had once worked in Mercy's halls, those who dared look too long at reflections, they would all say the same thing. Dr. Harland Vey was never seen arriving, because he had never left. It began with the wind, not a gust, not a howl, but a sustained pressure that pressed against the asylum walls like the slow tightening of a fist. By nightfall, the sky had turned black and the snow fell sideways, driven horizontal by a storm that came without warning, without origin. The lanterns flickered, the generator failed, and the entire compound sank into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow breath. The guards lit torches and patrolled in pairs, but even they admitted later that the air that night felt wrong. as though the walls themselves were shifting inward, as though the asylum was exhaling for the last time. The first scream came from the East Hall. A patient, unnamed, unseen, but unmistakably human. It was not fear. It was recognition, a sound that said, "I know what you are." Then another scream followed, this one sharper, then choked off. The guards ran toward the sealed wing, their footsteps muffled by thick snow, but stopped short when they caught the scent. Burned hair, scorched linen, something chemical and sweet beneath it all. They called for the doctors. No answer. They searched the nurses' quarters. Empty. The chapel, the kitchens, the library, dark, undisturbed. Then they reached the sealed wing. The door, which had never once been opened from the inside, now stood slightly ajar, just enough to let the warm scent leak out. They pushed it open. Inside, there were no patients. No screams, just silence and heat. The walls, once padded in wool and oak, were slick with condensation. The floors were coated in a thin layer of something dark, thicker than water, too thin to be blood. Every light fixture was shattered inward. The gurneys, once neatly aligned in rows, now stood empty, each stained with fresh markings that looked neither written nor carved but grown. Of the 21 doctors, there was no sign. Not a footprint, not a coat left behind. Only the instruments remained. Rows of surgical tools arranged with unnatural care, every blade still wet, every clamp and drill still warm to the touch. No blood dripped, no bodies lay hidden. Only steam rose from the tables, coiling in patterns that dissipated before they could be understood. One guard reached for a scalpel and yanked his hand away with a hiss. The metal burned, but not from fire, from something else, something recent. The wax faces in the library were untouched, but every cylinder had melted down to a puddle of blackened pulp, as if they'd screamed from within and finally collapsed. The chapel wires hung limp, their copper filaments severed cleanly, and the bodies that once twitched at the doctor's touch were gone, leaving only the smell of burnt tendon and something like singed feathers. In the courtyard, the stitched figure of the nurse had toppled, its limbs curled inward, crumbling as if turned to dust overnight. And above it all, the asylum's roof moaned in the wind, louder than ever before, as if something massive had torn itself from inside the walls and risen into the storm. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The sky was soft and blue. Birds returned. But not a single doctor remained. The director's body was found in his room untouched, eyes open, his mouth stuffed with pages from the ledger he never finished. The staff gathered in silence, not from grief, but awe, terror, reverence. Whatever had happened was beyond report, beyond reason. No one would speak of it, not to the county, not to the church. Mercy was shuttered within the week, and as the last wagon departed, one nurse glanced back at the main building and gasped. There, in the top window of the sealed wing, behind the fogged glass, stood a figure in a white coat, watching. Still, unblinking, waiting.